Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Academy. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president, and I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture entitled Innovating for the Future of Democracy, which will be delivered by Avril Haines, this semester's Leah Joyzell Distinguished Visitor. Avril will discuss a project she is developing during her fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford, which is, I might say, an exceptionally nice gig. And that explores innovations in democratic political structures and decision-making processes aimed at helping Western democracies become more effective, responsive, and resilient in the face of current challenges. For those of you who don't know, All Souls is the Oxford College without students, so the burdens on her are all her own. Let me begin by just saying a few words about the Leah Joyzell Distinguished Visitorship and about Leah herself, who is here in the audience tonight. Leah is a trustee at the Academy, the head of our finance committee, and while we always think of that as the pinnacle of anyone's life achievements, she is in fact a renowned investment manager and a pioneer in international small cap equity investing. So Leah is a rarity of the best kind. She is both a scholar and a financial wizard. She holds degrees from Radcliffe and Harvard, including a doctorate in modern European history, and her research, correct me if I'm wrong, was on British policies during the occupation immediately after World War II. Yeah, she's showing her ascent. As one of the first women on Wall Street in the 1970s, Leah's understanding of Europe and its history and its economics significantly informed her strategies and her market insights. She started her career at Lehman Brothers and later went on to found Wanger Asset Management, and after that, Lizard Investors, an investment management firm. Beyond her professional achievements, Leah has been a great public citizen in the worlds of academia and culture, serving on such boards as the Harvard University Board of Overseers and the Radcliffe Institute Dean's Advisory Council. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Global Advisory Council of Harvard, and the University of Chicago Harris Council. And she is also a senior fellow of the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. I should also say that she is an unparalleled source of good counsel and just a great person to have on our board. And I just want to add that the past Leah Joyzell Distinguished Visitors are a reflection of Leah's own breadth of interests and knowledge, and these have included the outstanding artist Theaster Gates, the brilliant architect Jeannie Gang, and now we have an Avril Haines. We have Avril Haines from the world of policy, politics, and law. I should add that the Leah Joyzell Fellowship, Distinguished Visitorship, was established by a group of friends, colleagues, and admirers of Leah, and we're thrilled to have it. Okay, about our speaker. As I'm guessing everyone here knows, Avril is the former U.S. Director of National Intelligence. She was a cabinet member during the Biden administration, and during that time, she led the U.S. intelligence community with its 18-member organizations and hundreds of thousands, almost 1 million employees. Is that correct? No, but you couldn't tell me, you'd have to kill me. So anyway, in this role, she served as the president's principal intelligence advisor, and we were comparing notes on who had bigger management challenges, me or her. I think she wins. She has held senior roles across government, including being principal deputy national security advisor, which in my view is the toughest job, certainly in the foreign policy side of the government, because it involves chairing the deputies committee where most of the toughest decisions in the policy process are made before all those fancy cabinet members come in and just say thumbs up. If this were a newspaper story, we'd probably use that ancient cliche and say that Avril has had a meteoric rise, except that meteors don't rise. But Avril has. She served as deputy director of the CIA. She was legal advisor to the National Security Council. She was slated to be the legal advisor at the State Department until other administration leaders decided that they wanted her for themselves. She has previously been assistant legal advisor for treaty affairs, deputy chief counsel to the U.S. Senate's Committee on Foreign Relations, and has left a huge and positive mark on policymaking in Washington. As I said, she's at All Souls. She is also a Carnegie Distinguished Fellow at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and a Senior Fellow at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. She has a law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center, and she served as a law clerk for Judge Danny Boggs on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Prior to law school, Avril did what all future intelligence chiefs do. She studied physics at the University of Chicago. She also, again, what all future intelligence chiefs do, she founded and ran a bookstore cafe for 5 years while doing all kinds of good works in Baltimore. Little known fact, she can repair cars. I am not making this up. And she has a pilot's license. She has been the recipient. I'm sorry? I mean, if you want to add, I'm happy to embellish here. She has been the recipient of numerous awards for her leadership and government service. She serves on a number of boards, including the Atlantic Council's International Advisory Board. On a personal note, President Truman famously said that if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. President Truman may not have been far off, but I'm sorry to say he never met Avril, who in all those years in her upside-down meteoric career managed to be an extraordinarily good colleague and friend to very many people. And I think if you called a meeting of the Friends of Avril Haines, I doubt they would fit in the building formerly known as the Kennedy Center. And I think that you would need something more along the lines of Berlin's Olympic Stadium. And I am not making this up. I certainly would be there. I'm hugely grateful to her for joining us today. Avril will deliver her lecture of an uncertain number of minutes. And after that, I will join her on stage for discussion and an audience Q&A. If you are here at the Academy, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Please make your questions brief and append a question mark to the end. If you're following on the live stream, type your question into the online Q&A. Without further ado, Avril, the floor is yours.
Good Lord, I'm going to have to pay him for that one. So thank you, Dan. That was absurd. And really, but thank you to the American Academy in Berlin for your extraordinary hospitality and the opportunity you afford people like me to learn from the exceptional scholars and practitioners who come together in this beautiful location. And I think, frankly, having a place where you can disconnect from the everyday insanity and step back to just think is perhaps needed more now than ever, given the pace at which our world is changing. So I'm also especially honored to be delivering the inaugural Leah Zell lecture, and frankly, just worried that my words won't do justice either to her or to this wonderful academy. Leah is a force of nature who has long championed and supported organizations that are crucial to democracy and our transatlantic alliance, organizations that promote strategic thinking and remind us of the values that inspire us. Organizations like this Academy, the Aspen Strategy Group, where we met for the first time, the German Marshall Fund, the International Rescue Committee, so many more that Dan mentioned. And I'm deeply grateful to her as someone who finds a quiet way to both embody the best that our country has to offer and to guide us, reminding us of the importance of engaging and taking responsibility for our future. It is a genuine honor to give this inaugural lecture in her name. I feel, like everyone else I suspect, that we are in a state of flux, quite uncertain and anxious about the future, but also sure that what we do in the next few years will determine the trajectory of not just our own communities or countries, but the globe. In today's world, more than ever before, our future is bound together in ways that we cannot control. I thought the Vice Premier of China summed it up well this year when he said, quote, "Countries are not riding separately in some 190 boats, but rather in a giant ship on which our shared destiny hinges." And this means that we must work together to shift the trajectory of where we appear to be headed, increasingly divided and unsympathetic to each other's plight. For as former President Biden was fond of saying, no nation can meet the challenges of today alone. And so I've been asking myself as I've gotten out of government, what I know so many of you are asking, what can I do to help get us on a better path? How can I help promote an environment in which individuals, institutions, and countries collaborate together to promote peace, foster progress in human achievement, and enhance liberty, dignity, and integrity among peoples and nations? Former President Eisenhower said in his farewell address to the nation at the end of his presidency in 1961, that these were the basic purposes of what he called America's adventure in free government. That is, to keep the peace, to foster progress in human achievement, and to enhance liberty, dignity, and integrity among people and among nations. He also said that to strive for less would be unworthy of a free and religious people. And while I'm not religious, at least in the conventional sense, I very much agree with him. Eisenhower's speech is remembered for his warning against the establishment of a military-industrial complex, but his message was actually much broader. He spoke of a great struggle engulfing the world, which at the time was Soviet influence as he saw it. But what is interesting to me is that the warning he was issuing was not about communism, but was instead about the methods we chose to wage the Cold War, which he thought could undermine the very principles for which the United States stood. And he pointed out that we will always have crises, and in meeting them, there is a, quote, reoccurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties, but that instead the answer would lie in good judgment that seeks balance and progress, and that it is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate forces new and old within the principle of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society. Together, he said, we must learn how to compose difference not with arms, but with intellect and decent purpose. As I look at today's challenges, I've come to the conclusion that there are two things I might work on in an effort to bend the arc of the universe toward the basic purpose of America's adventure in free government, as he termed it. Tasks that integrate the new and the old with the principles of our democratic system, that are less about what the solution is to every problem, but instead about how we approach finding the answers. And the first is to identify democratic innovations, changes to our political structures and decision-making processes that are likely to improve the resilience and the effectiveness of Western democracies in today's evolving technological, ecological, economic, and geopolitical landscape. And the second is to strengthen the ethics that guide us in public service. One is more about the intellect, and the other is more about decency. And both, I think, are fundamental to the resilience of our democracies. On the first, I've come to the somewhat jarring conclusion that our current political systems and decision-making processes are simply not fit for purpose in today's world. That isn't just that we need great leaders, though we do, but rather that our political institutions need real structural reforms if we are to have any hope of not only managing today's challenges, but also the challenges that are coming at us as a consequence of the development and adoption of artificial intelligence. And I see this as an urgent problem. Over the last century, we've seen the rapid spread of democracy followed by an equally impressive backsliding of democratic governance. At the turn of the century, only a handful of countries were democracies. Most of the world was governed by empires, monarchies, or colonial rule. And after decolonization and post-Cold War transitions in the late 1980s and 1990s, the number of electoral democracies surged. But since then, almost under every metric, democracies have been on the decline. And it is increasingly apparent that today's democracies are insufficiently resilient in the face of the challenges that they're confronting. Even within the democracies that remain standing, something important is happening. A 2023 Pew Poll research survey of 24 countries found that solid majorities still view representative democracy as a good system of government, but a median of 59% were dissatisfied with how their democracy is actually functioning, and fully 74% believe that their elected representatives don't care what people like them think. That's a stunning disconnect, and perhaps the most visceral sign of how dissatisfied voters are among democracies that held elections in 2024. Over 80% saw the incumbent party lose seats or vote share everywhere simultaneously. It's not a coincidence, it's a signal. And when you look across our democracies this way, you see that it is unlikely to be about any one leader or a particular population. It makes clear that the problem is more systemic. Researchers have highlighted how today's information environment poses challenges for democratic governance. And certainly, there have been no shortages of intensifying threats to manage, such as climate, disinformation, migration, that are overwhelming the capacity of governments to effectively address, particularly in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which may be part of the dissatisfaction that we're seeing. But I would argue that the problem runs deeper, that while this is all true, it is also true that our governments are having trouble making decisions that are in the clear interest of the majority. And even once we make such decisions, we have trouble implementing them effectively, more than we used to, in my experience as a civil servant. And political polarization, I would argue, is not the driver, it's a symptom. Unless our decision-making structures evolve, we're unlikely to emerge from this trajectory of backsliding. The proof of this is varied, and since I don't want to keep you here all night, I'm just going to note a few things. To start with, consider the regressive distribution of wealth that we see across Western democracies over the last several decades. Income inequality measured by the Gini coefficient has increased across the United States, Germany, France, and most other advanced economies since the 1990s. In the United States, less than 10% of families now possess roughly 70% of national wealth. And as of last year, the top 1% of U.S. households owned 31.7% of all American wealth, the highest share recorded since the Federal Reserve began tracking household wealth in 1989. Meanwhile, according to economists like Piketty and Sayers and Zugman, from 1980 to 2014, the average pre-tax real national income per adult stayed roughly the same for the bottom 50%, remaining at approximately $16,000 per year in real terms throughout those decades. And the share of taxable wages earned by the bottom 50% income earners fell from about 25% in 1970 to around 16 to 17% by the time of their study, meaning that the bottom half's claim on national wage income declined by roughly a third over approximately 5 decades as our country's wealth expanded. And these statistics reflect a profound shift in who benefits from economic growth in our country and who does not. And this trend is likely to be exacerbated by the development and deployment of artificial intelligence in our societies. Moreover, this distribution of economic outcomes is mirrored in the distribution of political influence. Martin Gillen's and Benjamin Page's careful empirical work has demonstrated that U.S. policy outcomes bear a strong relationship to the preferences of economically privileged groups, and a much weaker relationship to the preferences of average citizens. And this is not what a democracy is supposed to do, and people sense it even if they don't have access to the academic literature that documents it. My point is that if our political institutions were working, we would be self-correcting in response to the majority, but we are not. And even when I've worked for presidents who wanted to make those corrections, they found that our system essentially fought them every step of the way. The incentives were not on their side when it came to either passing the laws needed or implementing them. The growing dysfunction of our system shows up in other ways, too. Consider treaty ratification. As Dan noted, I have a particular affinity for treaties. During the first 200 years of the American Republic, the Senate approved more than 1,500 treaties. In the last 20 years, we've seen just over a dozen treaties get through the Senate. And we've struggled to ratify even relatively straightforward multilateral agreements that were modeled off of US law or consistent with it, like the Disabilities Convention, the Law of the Sea Treaty, many of which sit in a long queue of treaties untouched year after year, caught in partisan gridlock. The implications for our credibility and our ability to shape global rules are real, and we are not the only country for which it is an increasing challenge to get treaties approved by our legislature. This is just one of so many signals that our institutions are not working as they should be. Another is how hard it is for many of our governments to pass a budget, form governments, or pass legislation. For example, the US government has experienced repeated shutdowns and near shutdowns, with the debt ceiling periodically weaponized as a political instrument. France has struggled to establish a stable government and has leaned increasingly on emergency constitutional provisions to push through legislation that cannot get a majority, and has had numerous political and economic challenges finalizing its budget. Germany's 2017 coalition negotiations took 6 months, and we see the increasingly challenging politics of the UK. These are not isolated failures in individual countries. They are symptoms of political systems straining to process the complexity and polarization of contemporary democratic societies. So what I've been doing is identifying research and scholarship that help explain why we're seeing increasing dysfunction in our political systems. I know there is not one answer, and so I'm not looking for that. I'm looking across a range of potentially serious challenges that collectively, if mitigated, might help to improve our capacity to make and implement decisions. I have a list of 5 such challenges. None of them will surprise you. For each challenge, I'm trying to bring together groups from different walks of life, from the public sector, the private sector, academics, practitioners, academia, all across the sector, private, others, to discuss whether there are specific interventions or innovations to our democratic political structures that are decision-making processes that would allow us to overcome the current challenges that Western democracies face. The first is the information environment, fragmented, increasingly privatized, and turbocharged by technology in ways that reward outrage over deliberation and engagement over accuracy. The algorithmic architectures that govern how most people now receiving information have become, whatever their designers intended, engines of polarization and misinformation. The second is the regressive distribution of wealth I just described, and the growing influence of money in politics, which is especially challenging in the United States. And the third is global migration, which we discussed in a workshop this afternoon, including how surges of migration can be correlated to a predictable set of democratic stresses that are easily and often deliberately exploited for political purposes. The fourth is the rising power of private sector multinational institutions and individuals now capable of contesting state authority and forum shopping among governments in ways that were historically impossible, including control over the information architecture on which our democratic discourse depends and other critical infrastructure that governments rely on. And the fifth is the sheer volume of threats from beyond our borders that individual citizens feel subject to and expect government to manage, creating a persistent gap between what citizens expect and what governments can actually deliver, while simultaneously creating opportunities for the concentration and abuse of executive power. Increasingly, with each of these challenges are issues you will recognize as features of our society that we're all dealing with in different ways. Declining political and social trust, identity politics, the erosion of checks and balances, a growing desire for agency in societies where people feel increasingly disempowered, and the diminished space for civil society and social interaction. We had our first forum on the information environment, where we brought together academics, technologists, journalists, and practitioners. And I'll just tell you a little about our discussion, though our report will be published in the coming weeks. The forum identified 3 interlocking challenges to democratic governance. First, the institutions we rely upon to produce trustworthy information are in serious decline. Newspaper employment in the United States has fallen by roughly 80% since 1990. Nearly 1,800 local papers have closed since 2004, and similar patterns are visible across the UK, Canada, and Europe. The same pressures affect universities and statistical agencies, which constitute much of the infrastructure we rely on for shared, verifiable facts. And without reliable information, citizens cannot hold representatives accountable and policymakers cannot make sound decisions. Second, and perhaps more corrosive, are the challenges that arise from the fact that social media platforms are structurally incentivized to maximize engagement. And what maximizes engagement is outrage, simplification, tribal confirmations rather than accuracy or complexity. Algorithms amplify moral emotional content and misinformation, suppressing cross-cutting exposure, and fragment citizens into increasingly separate realities. And the result is not simply polarization, but a deteriorating epistemic foundation for democratic deliberation, where false information spreads faster than true information and institutional trust erodes in ways that produce cynicism and disengagement. And third, democracies are asymmetrically vulnerable to manipulation. The same openness that makes them admirable makes them exploitable. Foreign actors, criminal networks, commercial influence operations now operate at a scale and sophistication that was unthinkable a decade ago, which is compounded by artificial intelligence. And against this landscape, the Forum considered a range of democratic innovations worth taking seriously. On the information supply side, proposals were for publicly supported local journalism, modeled on what were other Western democracies already do, attracted strong consensus. The argument was straightforward: local news is a public good that markets will not sustain, and its absence weakens accountability at precisely the level where governments most directly affect people's lives. On the platform side, proposals ranged from reforms to liability protections for online services, to mandatory algorithmic auditing, to citizen-led bodies with oversight powers over algorithmic design. The Forum was candid that none of these are easy to implement or immune to capture, but the view was that some form of regulation is both necessary and overdue. And perhaps most promising was the turn toward democratic innovation in how citizens engage with information collectively. Citizen assemblies, citizen juries, and structured deliberative fora, when well-designed, properly resourced, and connected to actual decision-making, have been shown across hundreds of deployments internationally to produce informed, legitimate, and high-quality recommendations on even highly technical questions. They are not utopian experiments. They are tested ideals that can provide a foundation for new approaches to decision-making that help us to mitigate the challenges we see in our democracies. And many of them can be enhanced through technological tools, such as those being worked on by Audrey Tang. Needless to say, exactly as Eisenhower warned, there is no miraculous solution to these challenges, but rather a combination of ideas that help promote the principles of our democratic system, which would not only improve the information environment, but strengthen democratic participation. And if we don't find ways to address these challenges soon, not only will it continue to be near impossible for good leaders who try to implement an agenda that actually promotes the interests of the majority to succeed, but it will continue to make it easy for bad leaders to take advantage of our weaknesses as they seek to expand their power. For we have repeatedly seen how elected leaders with authoritarian tendencies are able to take advantage of the real grievances these challenges produce to dismantle the democratic institutions that we rely on to keep our power in check. Now, let me return briefly, I promise, to the second issue I mentioned, strengthening the ethics that guide us in public life. Going back to where I started, to promote an environment in which individuals, institutions, and countries collaborate together to promote peace, foster progress and human achievement, enhance liberty, dignity, and integrity among peoples and nations. It's not only necessary to have a government that's functional and capable of promoting the interests of its own citizens, but also for those who hold public office to be ethical and inspired to work for the good of others. And working as I have in national security, perhaps this message is especially salient for me, because we often exercise considerable authority on behalf of citizens who cannot directly monitor our actions, making trust and integrity essential to the very functioning of our democracy. But anyone who has worked in an institution knows that they function far better when there is a foundation of trust. And ethical behavior is the foundation for trust. I had the opportunity to see the value of this firsthand where institutions actually did what they were supposed to do because specific individuals acted with integrity, often at some personal cost, often when no one was watching, and often when it would have been easier to do otherwise. And when that happens, the results are infectious because we want to strive to be better. We are inspired in such moments. I know I was. And in this moment of transactionalism and cynicism, we must not lose track of how enriching those moments and the extraordinary relationships you develop out of those moments can be. So I'll end where I began. When Dwight Eisenhower gave his farewell address, I suspect some were surprised that a military leader and hero of World War II spoke of learning to address our differences not with arms, but with intellect and decent purpose. Or perhaps today, some may be surprised by the fact that he spoke not only of investing in ourselves, but about the importance of helping the world. I'll leave you with his closing words. To all the peoples of the world, I once more give expression to America's prayerful and continuing inspiration. We pray that peoples of all faiths, all races, all nations may have their great human needs satisfied, that those now denied opportunity shall come to enjoy it to the full, that all who yearn for freedom may experience its spiritual blessings, that those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibilities, that all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, that the scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made to disappear from the earth, and that in the goodness of time, all peoples who will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for that terrific set of remarks. I was really thrilled that you started off and ended with Eisenhower.
Use the mic, please.
I was really, yeah, sorry, it's late in the semester.
Thank you for not going to sleep.
Yeah.
By the way.
I was thrilled that you focused on Eisenhower. So when I was a speechwriter for President Clinton, I spent a lot of time reading other presidents' speeches. And for me, the biggest surprise was Eisenhower, who, in his rhetoric, comes across as something profoundly American, profoundly internationalist, concerned about people all around the world, and of course started all kinds of interesting programs. Now, he wasn't without his flaws. He was addicted to some really crazy covert actions, which was something that got started in a big way in his presidency. But his rhetoric was extraordinary, and so far from anything we've seen in recent years, that it really does bear revisiting. Was it? Do you have a larger interest in him, or is it just that fabulous farewell address?
No, well, I between when I took a break from government the last time, I spent time at Columbia, and of course he's a major, exactly. And so, yeah, so I started reading through a lot of his work, and it came back to me this last week, actually, as I was thinking about these issues.
So, I think you hit the big points where we have problems today, and I'm kind of interested in the drivers. I mean, we know that technology has galloped ahead. We know that that inequality has galloped ahead in the Western democracies, if not in the entire globe, in part because of technological advances, but also because of changes in society. But I'm kind of curious what you think about the quality of our political elites. I have to say, I'm not overwhelmed these days, and maybe that's an understatement. On the one hand, Bill Clinton used to always say that he regretted not having a heroic challenge, but on the other hand, there are plenty of heroic challenges around. It doesn't feel like we have many people who are really rising to meet them at the moment.
I mean, I actually think this is part of why I'm focused on the system. I think the system doesn't help. So let me give you an example of what I mean. It's so when we did this last information forum discussion, we decided we'd ask Claude, what do you think? What's a proposal for how to change the information environment or political systems? And Claude said, "You're focused on the wrong issue." If you look across the United States, on average, in primaries, candidates are elected with about 15% of the vote in primaries, and that 15% is a very ideologically motivated 15%. And so Claude's answer was, you should do a citizen jury or citizen assembly kind of thing for primaries instead of having a normal primary. And the citizen assembly, for anybody who doesn't know, is like you have a sortition method, right? You're trying to get a representative slice of the political and the polity, essentially, in which the election is happening, right? So you might say you want representation based on demographics, on geography, on income, a variety of things. And so you sort for that, in effect, but then you have a random selection. And Claude's answer was you bring them in for a weekend, you have them meet with the candidates, and ultimately they choose who runs in the general election. And this would mean that they would actually not be inclined in their political life, effectively, to try to just satisfy the 15% that they get elected by. They'd actually be incentivized to, in fact, take positions that are more consistent with the entire polity. So I do find, I can think of many people in the system who I think are extraordinary, but who ultimately the results don't reflect that. And I think that's a real problem, obviously.
And as we were discussing today, the irony is that the primary system was supposed to be a step ahead in greater democratization. And of course, it's resulted only in sort of the empowerment of ideological extremes that turn out for the primaries. The great American historian Gary Wills used to say that maybe we should make voting required,
Australia,
which is what it is in Australia.
Yeah.
I don't know. You think that would work?
No, I am not the expert on democracy. I am honestly, like, you might ask, so why am I doing this project? The expertise that I bring is something I've honed in government, which is how to find the most brilliant people and bring them together and actually curate a conversation so that I can lift up their ideas. And many of them are sitting right here. So I will stand back on what are the right solutions for democracy. What I'm really trying to do is sort of be a one-woman blue ribbon commission. I'm basically trying to lay out a whole series of really innovative ideas on how you can actually mitigate against some of these challenges. And some of them come from academics, some of them come from practitioners. They're coming from all different places. And I think they need to be looked at. And what I'm hoping to do is create a little bit of space for that conversation, because I think it's often, it just sounds quite jarring to say we need to innovate or change our, political systems and our processes, but we do. I can tell you from working it on the inside.
No debate on that. But then the question becomes, how does that, what are the triggers? How do you get the pivot so that these kinds of reforms, which seem to cut against both the political trends and the market trends, where's that going to come from?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a couple of things. One is, I think there may be opportunities that develop from with changes of government, new policy, that sort of thing, where you have the opportunity for some small things, right? Sometimes small things can set the ground for larger things. And I think that's worth understanding and exploring. And so, for example, in the context of citizen assemblies and citizen juries, I'm fascinated by the degree to which U.S. states are now experimenting with these. And I think that's a kind of interesting, and over time that may build, and we'll see what sort of comes out of it, right? That's sort of an example of one way this happens. I think another thing is that, particularly coming from a national security space, I see more crises in our future. It's not just in the United States. I see it happening in other places too.
Gee, thanks.
I know. It's an unfortunate reality, but those crises often give you an opportunity. And, you and I have both been in jobs where we've had those moments. And often what happens is you have an opportunity to make change. You know that change is needed. But that opportunity over even the course of my career has gotten shorter and shorter. Usually that window is quite small. And so you look for things like blue ribbon commissions, basically writing that's been done, work that's been done, intellectual ideas that have been sort of discussed and tested and evaluated. And you look for that work so that both you can say, okay, well, this is somebody, who I think thought deeply on these issues, who gives me a sort of good sense of what the pros and cons are. And I know from the report that there are a number of people who have discussed it, who have thought about it. I know which experts to go to understand it better, to bring them in, because you have to work very quickly in that moment to actually mobilize an idea. And I think much as we've seen over history, whether it happens in the United States, it happens in other places, as these innovations occur, they may come to other countries because of some, you see another country do it well and you think, let's try that. And it's going to look a little different in our system, but there's something here that's worth experimenting with. So that's what I'm hoping for over time.
I have to say that your last remark about innovations being picked up by different countries, if you look at American history, we weren't too good at picking up others' innovations, and we prided ourselves on our exceptionalism. And, there are justices on the Supreme Court who will refuse to ever cite foreign law. So I'm more hopeful about maybe Europe and other Western democracies picking up other innovations. But tell me I'm wrong.
Well, I think citizen assemblies and citizen juries, there's they're happening more in Europe and they're coming into the United States more. And Helen Landemer is one of the foremost scholars in this area at Harvard and is from France and, bringing some of that knowledge into the United States. So I think it's possible for us to learn and see that happen.
So
I'm going to pierce through your cynicism.
Yeah, please, please do. My family will be delighted. There's been one recent event that has given people hope in the sense that it would be nice if it started a trend. I'm curious what you think of it, which is the change of government in autocracy central in Hungary.
Yeah, really remarkable. And so heartening to see the people, on the street and the excitement with which, the election was received and so on. But I think it's interesting because I think there's, it will be very interesting to see how this proceeds, after the election. I think it's great that Marshall won and that we'll see a new leader. And but I don't know enough about him or his positions. And in this place, I think he campaigned largely on I'm not corrupt and, Orban is. And so it'll be interesting to see how this,
So in your discussion, you discussed, you referred to most of these different challenges that we see as kind of sui generis, that they developed of their own. I'm always struck by how concerted an effort some of our foreign opponents are in trying to undermine Western cohesion, undermine the fabric of society, things like that. The champion in this regard is Vladimir Putin. And I'm curious if you think that this is a major driver or that we should just focus on our own gardens.
Yeah, we talked about this. I think this is important to focus on. I'm quite parochial about that. Obviously, I have a bias coming from the national security community, and I spent so much of my time during my last job focusing on election security, on information campaigns, and so on. And I've seen the challenges that can be presented in these areas. And And I don't think they're going away, and you see how much more sophisticated they've become, essentially, and the way in which they're targeting the people that they target, the social engineering, the other sort of aspects of this. So I can sort of talk at length about this. At the same time, I do put ahead of that, from just my own prioritization of concern, frankly, what I mentioned in my remarks, which is the degree to which this structural incentive for platforms of engagement has resulted in a whole series of challenges in terms of the way in which information is being delivered, so that it is really creating, as one scholar put it at some point to me, epistemic bubbles, and it is ultimately sort of driving polarization in certain ways and creating challenges that are really sort of fundamental to our capacity to deliberate democratically. But I have to say, there really were an astonishing number of ideas for ways to help address it. And even, I should say, it will take political will to deal with it. But I found among the most interesting, or at least ones that I hadn't explored previously that were raised in this forum, were ideas of how you can use artificial intelligence actually to do the opposite, essentially, to basically create bridges between communities, to ensure that you're getting the other perspective as information is being provided to you. There's a variety of things and work that people are doing in this area that I think are really quite interesting. And it's also a way to say that I find it's really interesting to me, as I was looking at polling recently, that shows that in the United States, we are at the top of the chart, I think with Spain, interestingly, but at the top of the chart in terms of the level of anxiety in our society over artificial intelligence. It's really quite interesting. And when you look at countries in Asia, you see most optimism there in terms of what they perceive for artificial intelligence. And I do think in space, we have to be smart about this, which is to say, yeah, there's a lot to be concerned about. We need to address that, but we also need to make sure that we're developing what we can for good purposes, and think through how we can do it consistent with our values, consistent with all the other.
So you first asked Claude, and I'm just wondering if you've asked Mythos yet, and if you've gotten any better answers.
I know. That is a pretty remarkable, yeah.
Yeah, and scary. Okay, well, I think maybe we'll open it up to the audience now. I've nattered on long enough. Please do wait for the microphone. Grace. Whoop.
You noted in your comments about things that states can do, and something that I've noticed recently is like Hawaii, a blue state, and Montana, a red state, are pushing back on the notion that corporations are people, that these are false persons. And I found that very interesting, and I'm wondering if there are any other bright lights out there that states, both blue and red, are trying to set their own agendas for campaign finance and income inequality that that you can highlight.
Yeah, it's interesting because we were talking today, and there's some folks here who've been working on these issues who know a lot more about it than I do, but about what some of the states are doing in relation to migration, for example, and how they've been approaching this, and that in many respects, that came out in the information forum, and I suspect it will come out in others, which in the information forum, people talked about Governor Cox in Utah doing some things on social media platforms. There's some other, effort at regulation. In other words, there's some work that's being done in obviously blue states. I think we are seeing states do more in these spaces. And I think there is more space for states to do more, in a sense, because the politics is not quite as sort of dysfunctional as it is at the federal level at this stage. And among the things that I've heard folks talk about, for example, from the Democratic innovation community, is that mayors, are not listed as a Republican or a Democrat, right, in these spaces, and that there's a different kind of there are different opportunities as a consequence in those areas from city mayors to do things in certain places in the United States. So I think this is an area to watch. It's absolutely, yeah. I'm hoping that actually in federal government policy, we can actually encourage it in a way that allows for coordination and coalitions among states to do things more effectively. But
This gentleman right here. Right here. Rebecca, right in front of me. There he is.
I want to thank you for a very stimulating talk.
Kind.
In the light of the drone killings of leading Hamas, Iranian, Hezbollah leaders, and the apparent succession to a different generation, which seems to be even more militant, I'm wondering, since you have experience in that area from the Obama administration, what you think about that whole complex, because it increasingly in the world we as Americans are seen as virtually the same as the Russians are in eliminating their dissidents and their defectors in the West.
There's a lot there. Let me try to figure out if I've got the right pieces of it. I think so. I don't think we're the same as the Russians in this context. But let me pull that apart then maybe from the other. I mean, I think you're right that if, for example, if you look at Iran with the killing of the supreme leader and then obviously Mossadegh becoming the new supreme leader, that he is at least as conservative, and there's some arguments that he's even more conservative than his father was. But it's sort of unclear exactly how his ruling style, I think, will evolve in that space. And then, yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand the question in relation to drone killings, but so maybe I'll, leave that at that. I'm sorry. I'm probably not answering your question in the way that you wanted, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards if that's helpful.
Just wait for the mic.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for a stimulating lecture, Avril. I was wondering, if when a new administration comes into the United States government, there's going to be so much pressure, I think, to rebuild institutions that had been torn down or corrupted. Is that an emergency or an opportunity for a new administration from your perspective? And I'm sure it depends on which institution you're talking about, whether it's USAID or the Smithsonian, but maybe in the institutions that you know best, if you could speak about whether you see what opportunities you see and what emergencies you expect.
Feels like a whole nother lecture, doesn't it? I know, like that's a huge question. So look, I think, I mean, the federal government is smaller today than it was at the beginning of the administration, and I think you see in the national security space, to your point, a fair amount of changes throughout the infrastructure, and some parts of it I would absolutely want to see come back. Things like the Department of Public Integrity at the Department of Justice or other offices that I think are incredibly important. But I do think, to your point, that that it's worth thinking, as you sort of look at the infrastructure, how should we be designing this for today's world, right? And how can we do it in a way that's going to ensure that we're capable of managing the sort of mission that we're going to be asked to cover going forward? And there may be two ways of thinking about that. One is we may need to give some of the mission that the federal government typically has had to states, for example, because we're smaller and just sort of rebuilding it is not really going to work in the way that, a new president may not want to spend all of their time and energy and sort of capital, and it may be a fight with Congress, and there's all kinds of reasons for why they may just say, we're going to have to figure out what's most important here for the federal government and sort of look to see if there are other ways and institutions and so on to do it. But another is also to think about the fact that, the last really major restructuring, for example, of the national security community was after 9/11, and things have changed a lot. And there's been a fair amount of adjustments in different spaces, but you could imagine that there'd be a kind of okay, what's the right structure in this moment? And, will that be something that we could sort of move forward on as a basis? But yeah, sorry, it's a huge conversation for which every agency and department probably has another, discussion, but interesting question.
So I'm going to ask another one. The outline you have given could, if fully implemented, lead to incredibly wide-ranging changes in at least in the U.S. and certainly in other democracies as well. But I'm still focused on the U.S. and I'm just wondering if you think our Constitution is fit to purpose for this.
Well, I know there are some folks, like Larry Lessig has come out with some ideas for constitutional reforms. There's other academics who are thinking about these issues. I don't yet have a view on this, to be honest. I'm trying to expand my horizons to understand what the different options are. And I think the challenge with any kind of constitutional amendment is that obviously it will take an enormous lift to accomplish. And so in many respects, the question is, can we actually mitigate against the challenges that have been identified by so many great scholars, and I think some of them sitting right in front of me, for example, and Daniel Ziblatt and Mark Warren, others. Can we take that and can we actually do it without having to do a constitutional amendment? Because honestly, that's an easier option.
Even harder than treaties. Even harder than treaties. Well, Larry Lessig was, of course, a fellow here, so maybe we'll have the Constitutional Convention here. Okay. Anya. No? All right. Well, that's fine. No. Let Marilyn ask the question.
I so appreciate your moving beyond a really insightful analysis of the problems that plague backsliding Western democracies to convening these fora of experts across a wide swath of discipline. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how to implement these ideas. I think it's quite tempting to focus on 538 people who sit in the House and the Senate. But I have the impression that you're interested in working on a more granular level, on a local level, city council level. And so I'm wondering, how do you take these ideas that your experts have come up with and implement them on a really local level where I think it's important? That's where you're going to build trust.
Yeah.
And that's a huge deficit that we have. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, I wish I had all the answers at this stage. I don't, but I'll tell you some of the ideas, and I think this will evolve over time. But there are some ideas that have come up where, as you say, it's quite local, right? It's a sort of, I'll give you some examples. In the context of local reporting, for example, folks were bringing forward different things that different states have done to support local reporting in their state that have been quite effective and seem to be not politically controversial and so on. And so one of the ideas was, so how do you, to your point, right? How do you expand on that, right? And there's lots of tools that the federal government has to do that, in that even a president can do without necessarily having legislation passed. So you can, for example, in certain circumstances, provide like matching funds for doing things like that for any state that wants to do a mechanism along those lines to support their, so you can incentivize states to do certain things, right? You can create opportunities where you're sort of structuring it in a way, depending on the idea, in a sense that so that the federal government is helping to coordinate those things across different states, providing an opportunity for lessons learned and things like that. So there's all kinds of ways for the federal government to basically help to promote certain programs if they're shown to work. And then the idea is that basically the states have to decide for themselves, but they ultimately can produce sort of a kind of a momentum that ultimately makes these things plausible and effective. But I do think you're right that it's really looking at it from every level, because I think you really do have to think about it at every level. And I do think that most of the dysfunction, quite obviously, that we see is in the federal government. And you see things like the fact that there are so many unchallenged, we say unchallenged instead of uncontested, but unchallenged races in Congress, right? Those seats are ones where you have politicians who really aren't incentivized to compromise or to sort of understand the other side in a way. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't ever do it, but it does mean that it's sort of, again, the institutions, and in my experience, the incentives within institutions really matter. I mean, I've managed a lot of institutions in the U.S. government, and you learn how to structure things in order to ensure that certain priorities are dealt with, right? So that you can actually reach agreement on issues by creating a structure that is more likely to incentivize people. People can overcome a bad structure. You can find a leader, and put them in an office where you know that the structure is not good and is going to lead to more dissension, because you know that they're somebody who overcomes that. But it is so much easier if you actually have a structure that incentivizes that kind of, good decision making. So anyway, but really good question.
Anya, over here.
It piggybacks a little bit on that, but it sounds to me like we are stuck a little bit in this scenario where the executive branch has gotten more and more power, partly because Congress has failed to act, and or our elections produce a Congress that is impossible to act. And then we have these moments where change is possible, but the only tools we have sit with the executive. So you have an ever-increasing executive power. What do we do to ensure that there is a devolution of that power, even if it's messy?
Yeah, I mean, when I was looking across research and scholarship and thinking about how I would structure this project, one of the obvious examples of a place where our democracy has evolved in a way that was not anticipated at its founding, right, has now created a challenge in the decision-making process, right? Like, it's a sort of a perfect example of this. And just to make your point, I absolutely agree with it. I would say it's a long-term trend. It is not something that's just happened in this administration or the last, right? Like, it's been for many years. Anya worked in the Senate. I've worked in Congress. We've seen this over many generations, in a sense, and I think there are a lot of reasons for why it happens. But it has absolutely. It's almost like a trend that accelerates by virtue of the fact that the executive branch gets stronger, Congress gets weaker. Congress isn't able to make decisions about things that they need to make decisions on. And so the executive sort of continues to push forward because they feel as if they can't rely on the relationship even if they want to. And this sort of adds to this ongoing challenge. And obviously Congress is frustrated and unable to do the things that they want to do. And I think, this is one of those places. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to devolve power in the same way. I mean, when I think back to the beginning of our country, Congress was a lot smaller. There were a lot of structural things around it that made it possible for Congress to act in a more agile way that it can't in today's world. And the executive branch, the fact is, it's almost like, when you're a lawyer and you know that you always want to have the pen, right? Because if you have the pen, you're going to have much more control over how things get, ultimately settled, right? And the executive's got the pen. It is, they are the ones that are executing, and as a consequence, authoritarians, it's very challenging for Congress to actually step into the fray and stop them from, for example, interpreting the law that they passed in ways that are very expansive or things along those lines. So I think this is another thing where it's trying to figure out how do we manage what we can't change, and how do we change what we can change to actually get to a better place? And it's a great question. Maybe we should be considering some more, like revolutionary ideas in that space too. And how could we do that?
Professor Zeblatt.
On that last point, I mean, the Reconstruction era was, of course, a period where, in the face of a dysfunctional president and overwhelming majorities, you actually don't need the president to pass constitutional amendments. I mean, so that maybe seems like an implausible scenario, but there is a way in which the politics was centered in Congress for a moment.
Daniel, do you think it's possible? What's your reaction?
Well, I would say, if there were overwhelming majorities. I mean, the reason why there were overwhelming majorities was because the southern states were disenfranchised. I mean, they weren't voting. But you could imagine a scenario where Democrats have 2/3 of the vote. I mean, maybe not, but it's. But there's some way in. The point being, though, that there is a historical precedent for that, and if we want to look for moments where there has been major constitutional changes, that's the moment where it's happened, is when Congress was in charge, in fact. So
but
maybe
it's
that's
been a long time.
it's been a long time, and the executive's much stronger now than it was.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, but my question, though, was in some ways coming back to the question earlier here about, one of the challenges of post-populist authoritarian governments, as we've seen in Poland and in Hungary, is this dilemma of how do you essentially purge the former authoritarians who've now captured the state. They've captured the state, and so in Poland they weren't really able to do this because they didn't have a 2/3 majority, and so then they've been hampered by this. Hungary, it appears as if with this 2/3 majority, without a president, they're able to. We'll see what happens.
I know.
And so I'm wondering, in your view, what would be the highest? This is a different version of the same question. What would be the highest priority area? If one person I've heard give the advice in a post-authoritarian moment, you should be focused. Ruthless but focused. So in other words, figure out what are the highest priority areas that you want to transform, because you don't have much time, but not everywhere. So what agencies of the government would be the top priority that need revamping after a Trump presidency?
But are you asking from a national security standpoint, or are you asking from a democracy standpoint?
Well, from either. What from your view?
So I think they're different. In other words, from a democracy standpoint, my view is that it's going to matter what the crisis is. So, because I think you're not going to get major change without a crisis, and I think the crisis will sort of frame the window that you've got and what the potential options are. Even so, and this is sort of, per our conversation, like you have to plan for that moment and have a lot of different ideas that you think actually could matter. And then the question based on the crisis is, what can you get done? Right. So I take from that perspective, and I think the challenge on the democracy side, it's so much more political, and it's so much more, a feature of what you're able to do in that moment. When it comes to national security, I think right now I'm most worried about the rule of law and the Department of Justice. And I think that's the space that I would be focused on, as a president, probably coming in that context.
Yeah, I share that view with something like a quarter to a half of the department is gone. It's staggering. Sebastian, I saw you had your hand up.
Thank you very much. On the democracy side, you mentioned that people obviously have expectations from the leaders to get things done. Now, there is a whole bunch of countries that are not democratic, but actually sell that they are better in getting things done. Obviously, China is on the point, but also on a quasi-democratic, more authoritarian democratic side, in a benign way, Singapore comes to mind. That people are attracted by that model of government. Is that a concern in your project? How do you react to the fact that people look at these countries and these modes of government and don't seem too convinced from the democratic idea anymore? Is that something that you deal with?
Yeah, so I mentioned the polling that I was reflecting on, and it does reflect that a majority of the populations in democracies actually perceive democracy as the best form of government. So that is the current situation. You're at the same time, you're still right, obviously, that more people have been looking at authoritarian models and saying, "Gee, they get things done," and seeing the value in that. I personally find that generally, though, when you ask populations where would you prefer to live, they tend to say in democracies, and I don't want to over sort of index on that, but I do think, at least from my perspective, I want to live in a country that provides for self-governance, and that ultimately I have an opportunity to change the leaders' perspectives or the leader themselves over time. And I see that as still a crucial value. I think that what I'm reflecting in my discussion, though, is really more the fact that I think it's a real problem that we're not delivering for our citizens, and that is quite clear, and that's got to change. So, so I'm not so worried about whether or not we'll all shift to wanting to be authoritarians, but I do think, we will continue to see backsliding, because we'll create this vulnerability in our democracies where ultimately, because of these real grievances, people who get elected who have authoritarian tendencies and want to expand their power can weaponize them in ways that dismantle our democracies.
Can you give us and this is an unfair question, so you can decline, but can you give us a peek ahead at how you want to, at some of the thoughts you have on dealing with individuals or multinational corporations that possess so much power that they're sort of laws unto themselves now?
No, honestly, I don't know what the answer to that is, and we haven't had that forum yet. And but also, I have to say, it is a really challenging issue. So, and I'll spend a moment admiring the problem for a moment, if you don't mind. But here's the thing: from a national security standpoint, I come at this on the one hand, recognizing that, frankly, we in the government, in the national security community, for the last decade or so or more, really, have been saying it is increasingly important that we work with the private sector so that we can actually do national security. So what I mean by that is as follows. One is, I was a physics student, as Dan mentioned in the exhaustive biography that you got. And when I was a physics student, the vast majority of cutting edge sort of work in physics was funded by the US government, right? That is no longer the case. When you look at investment in research and development across, our country, for example, or even globally, still the United States puts the most investment in research and development. But over the last 30 years, basically the federal government's investment has essentially plateaued in real dollars. And it's really the private sector that has been putting in money into research and development in cutting edge science and technology. And so, we look at that in the national security community and we recognize, like, we absolutely need to understand what the cutting edge technologies are. We need to be working with the private sector to understand that. So much of the knowledge and experience and innovation that's happening is happening in the private sector. We absolutely need to be talking to those folks and understanding it and working with them and having exchanges and so on for national security reasons. Secondly, look at the fact that so much of the private sector is important to our national security now in ways that it wasn't 30 years ago. So I'll give you an example. The vast majority, we would say 85%, some people would say larger than that, of our critical infrastructure is privately owned and operated, right? So if there's a cyber attack or anything like that, we know we need to work with the private sector to help them be resilient, because that will be a major national security issue for us. But alongside that has developed strategic competition with China, right? Sectors of our economy are important to our national security. We need to help them be more resilient so that their intellectual property is protected, so that, a whole series of things like those. So so we've been talking in the national security community for some time about the importance of working more closely with the private sector, and I think that's important. At the same time, as we're doing that, we absolutely have to make sure that that there are guardrails around that, right? That the private sector isn't able to basically improperly influence the government, is in fact unable to just do an end run around the democratic system, right? Is unable to, promote their own opinion over what's in the best interest of the country. And we're seeing more and more the leverage that actors in the private sector have and their capacity to do so. And I think that is a huge challenge because of this, particularly this capacity to forum shop between governments, right? If you can say to a government, sure, you can pass that law that, manages me basically, but I'll just take all of my jobs and I'll leave for the next country and you're not going to have them. That's a huge amount of power. We've seen already the private sector do that between states. So it is not an easy thing to imagine how we're going to, manage that, but we got a forum on that. Don't worry. I know.
All right, one last question. I see one all the way in the back. All right, so we'll have two last questions because I want to get both going too.
Thank you.
Yeah,
you talked a lot about the need for representation, and my question would be, do you think that the revolutionary political change is possible within the two-party system, or is there a need for more political parties in the USA to more truly represent the people?
Yeah, I'm sorry I called on him. I don't know. Yeah.
This was also Dan's question. I know that's the. We were talking about the fact that, we used to think that the two-party system was more protective in many respects of, more resilient in the face of authoritarian or some of the issues that we're seeing. And now we're seeing actually the checks and balances in some respects are managed more effectively by multi-party systems, and that you end up in this situation where, it's not a winner takes all, right, sort of scenario as it is in a two-party system when you've got multiple parties. So I think it's at least a question that should be asked and something that we should be thinking about.
Last question right here.
Gabriel Deutscher. So my question would be, you focused more on the situation when you have a change to the better. But my question would be, if you expect a change to the worse, how would you harden institutions before something happens?
Yeah.
Welcome to Central Europe.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, no, it's good. I'm trying so desperately to focus on something good for the future. I do think in each of our discussions, to be honest, there's a fair amount of thinking that goes into how can this go wrong, right? Like, in other words, if we make this change, will it actually make things worse? Or, is there a way for capture to occur, as I mentioned, in the context of some of the ideas that were proposed in the Information Environment Forum? So we are trying to think about the sort of, you may design it for good, but it could be ultimately used in a bad way. But I am not doing a project on how to harden us from further decline. I'm really trying to focus on a brighter future. So that's my answer. You should do that project. I will support you. I'm like, that sounds good.
Well, that's a great place to stop, I think. Maybe not as optimistic as I would like, but on an optimistic note, if we need a one-woman blue ribbon commission, I am really glad it is you, Avril, because I'm glad you're working on the problems, because these are staggeringly large issues. You didn't want to drag other people, and have a big blue ribbon commission.
I'm not sure. I still have skepticism about how successful I will be at all of this. But many people, God knows, many people have really been incredibly wonderful in giving their time and effort to this. So I am really, really grateful.
Well,
anyway.
The American Academy is glad that it could be part of the process.